The fluorescent lights flickered in the underground bunker, casting nervous shadows on the stone walls. A speaker hissed to life, and then came the voice, calm, deliberate, dripping with betrayal. Traoré is popular now, but that won't last. Paris has approved the transition. Once the pressure builds, we move. Ibrahim Traoré stood completely still. He didn't flinch, he didn't ask questions. He just listened, jaw tight, eyes cold, hands folded behind his back like a man who had heard enough lies for one lifetime. Around him, his inner circle sat in stunned silence, faces pale, breaths held. They recognized the voices, friends, advisors, brothers-in-arms, now traitors. The recording ended, leaving behind only the buzz of fluorescent lights and the weight of silence. Traoré turned slowly to his men. "Seal the city," he said quietly. That was all. No outrage, no panic. Just command, clean, final, and absolute. But how did it come to this? How did a hidden device capture a conspiracy that would shake the future of an entire nation? Before we rewind this explosive story, make sure you hit subscribe and turn on the bell. Because in this battle for Africa's soul, every second of truth counts. Now, let's go back to where the betrayal began. To understand why that secret recording sent shockwaves through Burkina Faso's corridors of power, we have to go back to 2022 when a young little-known military captain named Ibrahim Traoré shocked the world. In a nation gripped by violence and instability, where terror groups claimed village after village and government promises dissolved like dust, the people had lost hope. French troops were still on the ground, claiming to help but protecting their own interests. Corruption thrived, unemployment soared, and the streets of Ouagadougou echoed with frustration. The old guard, loyal to foreign powers and their own pockets, had failed. Then came Traoré, a soldier, yes, but also something more dangerous, a believer. At just 34, he led a coup that many didn't see coming, and within days he had become the face of a new generation. He wasn't interested in diplomacy with colonizers or long speeches at international forums. His first major act? Ordering French troops to leave. Not negotiate, not redeploy, leave. Burkina Faso would no longer be a puppet. That single move sent a message across Africa. The era of quiet submission was over. Traoré began redirecting resources to local communities, setting up self-defense programs in rural areas, and empowering youth movements to take part in rebuilding the nation. While international headlines called him reckless, young Africans called him a hero. His approval soared, not just in Burkina Faso but across the continent. But popularity comes at a cost. For every village that cheered his name, there were politicians grinding their teeth in silence. For every policy that broke with the West, there were whispers in embassies and late-night phone calls between generals and foreign agents. France, long used to pulling strings in West Africa, saw its influence crumbling. The elites, many of whom had built careers on handshakes with Western diplomats, now feared they were being left behind. Traoré, whether he knew it or not, had painted a target on his back. He wasn't just fighting insurgents in the north, he was now up against a silent alliance of international power brokers, economic elites, and bitter former allies who felt betrayed by the very revolution they once claimed to support. The betrayal wasn't sudden. It was brewing, quietly, methodically, until that one moment, in a hidden room, when they finally thought he wouldn't notice. But he did. And that brings us back to the recording, the spark that revealed a storm already gathering in the shadows. It began in the dark, beneath the cover of the night, in a villa where the air felt heavier than it should have, a villa that belonged to none of them, but all of them used it. The heavy wooden doors creaked as they opened one by one, allowing 3 of the highest-ranking officials in the country to step inside, each with their own agenda, each carrying their own fears of a new world that didn't need them. Tonight was the night they had chosen to act. The first to arrive was General Dama, a man whose age had caught up with him in ways his military titles could not conceal. His face, once full of pride and military precision, now carried the weight of years spent ingrained in a system that was crumbling beneath him. He paused just inside the door, his eyes scanning the room. Colonel Nikima was already seated, his legs crossed confidently, and a glass of dark liquor in hand. He was younger, brimming with ambition that had long outgrown the limits of his uniform. "Let's get to the point," Colonel Nikima said, not even waiting for the general to sit. "Traoré is becoming a problem. He's too unpredictable, too dangerous. We can't sit back any longer. He's pushing us into isolation, defying the West, defying France. This country can't survive without foreign aid. The IMF will shut us down. It's already happening." General Dama nodded slowly, his brow furrowed. "I agree. His decisions are reckless. But what's our next step? He has the army, the people. We won't just take him out with a few speeches." "There are other ways," Nikima replied with a smirk. "We can destabilize the economy, raise fuel prices, cut subsidies, and delay wages. Let the people suffer. Once the unrest begins, we can present ourselves as the restorers of order. The public will beg for it. The military will follow. France will back us. We'll have the power." "But what about the youth movements?" Dama asked, the concern showing in his voice. The people had begun to rally behind Traoré, particularly the young who saw him as their symbol of resistance against foreign domination. "They won't just roll over." "That's the beauty of it," Nikima said. "We'll have them on our side before they even know what's happening. We'll turn the narrative in our favor. It won't be about the youth. It'll be about the collapse of the nation, the need for a strong hand, for a return to stability." He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "The people will have no choice but to back us once the protests start. When the country falls apart, they'll want someone to fix it." There was a pause, a moment of quiet tension hanging in the room. Minister Kabore, who had been silent until now, stirred in his chair. He was a man whose loyalty had always been rooted in self-interest, a politician who saw the world through the lens of power and opportunity. He cleared his throat and added, "We have everything in place. Once the economy collapses, we can move quickly. France is already prepared to step in. They'll support whoever we install as the interim leadership. We just need the right moment." As the men discussed their plans, unaware of the ears listening just beyond the door, Isufu, the trusted guard who had long been loyal to Traoré, silently recorded their every word. He had watched the late-night meetings for weeks now, seen the glances, the quiet exchanges, and something had told him to pay attention. Something felt wrong. But it was only tonight, as he saw the men slip inside, that he knew it was time to act. He moved swiftly, unnoticed, slipping a small recorder beneath the console at the back of the room. He knew the words that would be spoken here would not remain hidden. As the 3 men continued to plot, Isufu quietly left, taking the recorder with him, sealed in an envelope with no name, only the words, "For Traoré." The next morning, the device was delivered to the Presidential Security Office. The chain of command was swift. Ibrahim Traoré didn't hesitate. He took the recording, and without a word to anyone, retreated to his private study, locking the door behind him. Sitting at his desk, he placed the recorder down. His hand lingered on the play button for a moment, the weight of what he was about to hear sitting heavy in the air. Traoré had long known of the whispers, the murmurs of discontent from within his own ranks, but hearing it, the betrayal laid bare in the cold, calculating voices was something else entirely. The recording began, and the words hit him like a fist. The conspirators spoke with the kind of certainty only those who had already lost their moral compass could muster. They spoke of destabilization, of economic ruin, of plans to sell the country back to the West. The voices of men who had once sworn their loyalty to him now echoed through the room like a death knell. General Dama, Colonel Nikiema, Minister Kabore, each one sounded so sure, so confident. But this wasn't just political scheming. This was personal. This was treason. Traoré didn't flinch. He didn't shout. He didn't even pause the recording. He simply listened, each word sinking deeper into his resolve. When the recording ended, there was no need for emotion. The facts were undeniable. The truth was clear. There was no going back now. His vision for a sovereign, free Burkina Faso was under threat, and the enemy was already inside the gates. He stood up, his movements calm, controlled. Without a word, he walked to the window, his gaze falling on the city below. The people didn't know it yet, but their fight for freedom was about to take a sharp turn. Traoré was no longer just a leader. He was a man at war, and now he was ready to defend the revolution, not with speeches, but with action. The time for waiting was over. The night hung thick with anticipation. A cold wind swept through the streets of Ouagadougou, but in the presidential palace, the air inside was far from chilled. It was thick with tension. Ibrahim Traoré paced across his study, the weight of the decision before him bearing down. The moment of reckoning had come. His enemies were already within his walls, and he had no time to waste. He moved swiftly, his eyes sharp, his posture resolute. It was not just a betrayal he was confronting. It was a direct assault on the future of his country, on the dream of an Africa free from colonial influence. The weight of the responsibility was both heavy and motivating. He had fought for this moment, this freedom. Now he would fight for its survival. In the shadows, behind the iron doors of his inner circle, Traoré quietly summoned his most trusted military leaders. There would be no time for delays or distractions. The plot against him had been exposed, and he needed to act, swiftly, decisively. He could not afford hesitation. As the appointed hour neared, the palace guards, under his strict orders, began to move. At exactly midnight, a series of simultaneous arrests would unfold, catching the conspirators off guard. There would be no escape for those who had dared to betray the people of Burkina Faso. The conspirators had planned to move quickly, but they had never expected their own secret to be exposed so soon. General Dama, Colonel Nikiema, and Minister Kabore had already begun making their moves, thinking themselves untouchable, confident in the support they had from foreign powers and some factions within the military. They believed they could turn the people against Traoré. They thought their coup would be as simple as a swift strike, but they had underestimated one thing. They had underestimated Ibrahim Traoré's resolve. At midnight, the trap was sprung. Guards loyal to Traoré burst into the homes of the three men in separate, coordinated raids. They had expected a resistance, but none came. They had underestimated how deeply their betrayal had already cut into the fabric of the military. Those still loyal to Traoré didn't flinch. They had been waiting for this moment, and now it was time to act. General Dama was taken in his lavish home, still in his pajamas, his face contorted with shock as the guards burst in. Colonel Nikiema tried to fight back, reaching for his weapon, but was quickly subdued, his own men turning on him. Minister Kabore, the smooth-talking politician, was captured at his office, his final attempt at smooth negotiation failing in the face of Traoré's unshakable grip on the military and the people. Once the traitors were secure, they were brought to the presidential palace, stripped of their power, their dignity, and their illusions of invincibility. Traoré waited for them in the war room. The atmosphere in the room was tense as soldiers and military leaders gathered around, their eyes fixed on the traitors. Traoré entered the room, his face unreadable. The silence in the air was suffocating. He stood before the three men, who sat bound and kneeling, eyes wide with fear and disbelief. General Dama looked up at him with a mix of confusion and defiance. "This is madness, Traoré," he spat. "You think you can stop this? You'll never survive the storm we've set in motion." Traoré's gaze was unwavering. He said nothing. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket, withdrew a small recorder, and placed it on the table in front of them. The room fell completely silent. General Dama's face paled. Colonel Nikiema's eyes darted nervously, while Kabore tried to hide his growing anxiety. They all knew what was coming. Without a word, Traoré pressed play. The sound of the conversation from the night of their betrayal filled the room. The voices of men who had once pledged their loyalty to him, now echoing like a sentence of death. The men on their knees shifted uncomfortably as they heard their own words. "Traoré is finished," one voice said. "Once we destabilize the economy, the people will turn on him. It's only a matter of time." Another voice laughed. "The IMF will restore order. France will back us. We'll put a new government in place, one that knows how to do business." The final voice, sharp and cold, added, "Let's bring stability back to Burkina Faso." He won't last. The recording continued, every word an indictment of their treachery. When it ended, the room remained heavy with silence. Traoré stood, his expression unchanged. He hadn't needed to speak. The truth had been laid bare before everyone. His eyes flickered to the three men who had tried to destroy him, and then he turned to the soldiers gathered around him. "These men," he began, his voice steady and filled with a quiet fury, "thought they could betray the people. They thought they could sell us out for their own selfish ambitions, for foreign powers that seek to keep us enslaved. They were wrong." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. Then he looked directly at the traitors, his gaze unyielding. "Burkina Faso will never kneel again. The people have spoken. The revolution will continue. It will not be stopped by traitors in our midst, no matter how high their positions. We will take back what is ours, and we will move forward, together." General Dama, with a bitter laugh, tried to deny it all. "This is a mistake. You'll regret this, Traoré. You can't win. The world is against you." Traoré stepped forward, his voice growing colder. "I've already won. The people are with me, and I will do whatever it takes to protect the future of this nation." His words hung in the air, filled with both mercy and unyielding strength. He would not kill them, but they would be exiled, stripped of their rank and power, never to return. His justice was as merciful as it was firm. Burkina Faso would not be ruled by traitors. Turning his back on them, Traoré gave the final command. The men were escorted out of the room, their fate sealed. As the door closed behind them, Traoré turned to his men and spoke once more. "We must remain vigilant. The fight has only begun." The revolution was no longer a dream. It was a force, a storm that no one, inside or outside of Burkina Faso, could stop. As dawn broke over Ouagadougou, a wave of energy spread through the city like a wildfire. It started with whispers in the streets, rumors that Traoré had taken control, that the traitors had been exposed, that Burkina Faso's revolution was far from over. Within hours, those whispers turned into shouts, and those shouts turned into a full-scale outpouring of support from the citizens. The streets of the capital were alive with a collective energy that hadn't been felt in years. People of all ages, from the young to the elderly, took to the streets in massive numbers, waving flags, chanting slogans of resistance, and showing their unwavering support for the leader who had stood up against the old powers. Traoré had become more than just a military figure. He had become a symbol of African sovereignty, a living embodiment of the dream to reclaim control from foreign interference and internal corruption. It was a surreal sight. The air, once thick with tension and fear, was now electric with hope. The people had spoken with their feet. The coup had failed, but in its wake, a revolution was born. Yet, not everyone shared in the jubilation. As Traoré's popularity exploded across the nation, international powers began to feel the tremors. France, which had long maintained a tight grip over Burkina Faso's politics and economy, wasted no time in trying to shape the narrative. The French media launched an immediate smear campaign, labeling Traoré's actions as authoritarian, accusing him of undermining democracy, and warning of the instability he would bring. They called him a dictator in the making, a man who would ruin the hard-fought progress of the past. But the people weren't listening. The African media, in stark contrast, began to glorify Traoré as a beacon of resistance. On the continent, he was no longer just a leader in Burkina Faso. He had become a hero for the entire African diaspora. His defiance against France was seen as a new chapter in the continent's struggle for true independence. News outlets from Kenya to Senegal were running features on him, praising his bold stand for African sovereignty and casting him as the face of a new wave of revolution. The contrast between the French and African coverage couldn't have been starker. One side painted him as a tyrant, the other as a freedom fighter. This media war had a profound effect on Traoré's image. Within Burkina Faso, he was untouchable. His decision to remove French troops had resonated with the people in a way that few could have predicted. His actions had spoken louder than any political speech could, and he had quickly become an icon of hope for millions who had long suffered under colonial exploitation and political stagnation. But as Traoré basked in this newfound adulation, enemies were regrouping in the shadows, plotting their next move. They had underestimated him before, but they would not make that mistake again. Several high-ranking officials within Burkina Faso, still loyal to the old guard, began to meet in secret. They knew the people were behind Traoré now, but they also knew that power, true power, was not solely in the hands of the people. There were still foreign interests to contend with, and the forces that had once supported the coup attempt would not let this new form of leadership go unchallenged. Behind closed doors, diplomats from the European Union, the United States, and ECOWAS exchanged urgent messages. Their tone was measured but undeniably worried. The West was growing increasingly uneasy. The possibility of Traoré spreading his ideals to other African nations was becoming a real threat. Burkina Faso's actions, if left unchecked, could set off a chain reaction. What began as a rebellion in one nation had the potential to spread throughout the continent. Revolutionary ideals, anti-colonial fervor, and a shift in the global balance of power. The fear was palpable. ECOWAS, a regional political and economic union, began making veiled threats of intervention. Their message was clear. Stability must be maintained at all costs. Traoré's challenge to the established order was a direct threat to the status quo of the region. The Union could not afford to let such a movement go unchallenged. They were prepared to act. If Traoré's revolution spread further, the entire region could face instability. But Traoré wasn't backing down. In his first public address following the events of the coup, he stood at a podium before an enormous crowd, a sea of supporters stretching out in every direction. He was flanked by military leaders, and his voice rang clear over the microphone as he spoke. "We will not allow ourselves to be subjugated again. This is the beginning of a new chapter in our history. Burkina Faso is no longer a pawn in the game of foreign powers. We are our own masters, and we will chart our own course. Together we will rise. His words, though powerful, were not without consequence. They only further escalated the tension between Burkina Faso and the Western powers. Diplomats, military strategists, and analysts scrambled behind closed doors, weighing their options. The specter of another African revolution loomed larger with every passing day. Internally, the people continued to rally behind him. The streets were filled with chants of Traoré for president, as youth groups, student organizations, and unions pledged their allegiance to his cause. But this growing movement had its dangers. The revolution was not a simple victory. It was the start of a long and difficult struggle. The supporters in the streets may have been loud, but the forces conspiring against him were powerful and vast. He had won a battle, but the war was far from over. As the days went by, it became evident that the real test for Traoré's leadership was just beginning. The tide of support from the streets would have to be translated into long-term political stability, economic recovery, and the restoration of sovereignty. It was not enough to expose the traitors. He had to build a lasting legacy. And though the world was watching, the question remained: would his vision for a free and sovereign Burkina Faso survive the pressure mounting from both inside and outside the country? The battle for Burkina Faso had just begun, and the stakes higher than ever. As the dust of the coup settled, the streets of Ouagadougou began to calm. The city had witnessed the rise of a new hero, but the question still lingered in the air. Had the revolution truly been saved, or had it merely been delayed? Traoré, alone in his thoughts, stood looking out over the cityscape from his office. The revolution had brought him to this moment, but it was far from the end. The enemies had not been vanquished, merely put on pause. The political and economic systems that had bound Burkina Faso to foreign powers were not going to unravel overnight. But one thing was certain: Burkina Faso would never kneel again. His vision for an Africa free from external interference had taken root, and now it was time to nurture it. In the days that followed, Traoré visited villages that had once been ravaged by extremist attacks, their fields burnt, their homes destroyed. These were the forgotten corners of his country, where the price of revolution had been paid in blood and fear. As his convoy rolled into one of these villages, the people gathered in the streets, their faces lighting up with a sense of hope they hadn't known in years. They cheered for him, their leader who had turned their suffering into strength. An elder, weathered by time but bright-eyed with conviction, stepped forward. He placed his hand on Traoré's shoulder and said, "We now have a leader who listens with both ears and acts with both hands. You have shown us that words alone are not enough. You've turned your promises into action." Those words lingered in Traoré's mind long after they had left the elder's lips. The people were no longer just following him. They believed in him. And belief, he knew, was the foundation of any true revolution. This wasn't about power for the sake of power. It was about creating a lasting change that would define a new era for Africa. As Traoré stood before the crowd, the cheers rising around him like the beating of a heart, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride. But there was no time to rest. His work was far from over. The wind picked up, rustling the trees, and for a moment everything fell silent. In that quiet, Traoré spoke, his voice carrying over the gathered crowd. "This is not just my victory. It is the victory of every African who has ever dreamed of a future free from the chains of colonialism. We are not simply building a new Burkina Faso. We are laying the foundation for a new Africa, an Africa that stands tall and independent, an Africa that rises on its own terms. His words hung in the air like a promise that, no matter the challenges ahead, Africa's future would be shaped by its own hands, its own vision. As he looked around at the faces of his people, old and young, they were not just his supporters, they were his legacy. And so, as the sun began to set on that day, casting long shadows over the village, the final image of Ibrahim Traoré was not of a man in power, but of a leader among his people, silent but resolute, standing at the crossroads of Africa's future. A revolutionary, not just for Burkina Faso, but for Africa itself.